My name is Rachel Thompson. I'm 36 years old, and I never imagined I'd be telling this story out loud. If you believe in honest stories about family, second chances, and the strange ways love can break and heal, stay with me. And if you want to hear the rest as it unfolds, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss it. Tonight's story is called Mom Called Me a Burden, Now She Begs Me for Rent. It started at a dinner table that had seen 1,000 quiet blessings and a handful of silent wars. Roast chicken, green beans with too much salt, my father's fork tapping the rim of his plate like a men's watch ticking in a quiet room. My brother telling a story about someone who knew someone who could get him a better job. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old victories. My mother lifted her wine, Merlot, always Merlot, and smiled the kind of smile that looks like it knows something you don't. She turned to me. "You are nothing but a burden," she said, 14 letters and a lifetime inside them. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. The room didn't move, but it felt like it tilted. Steam rose from the potatoes, and I watched it like a child watches her breath in winter, proof that she's still here, even when she wishes she weren't. My father cleared his throat and looked down, as if there might be an answer in the gravy. My brother stopped talking but didn't protest. The chandelier hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world didn't stop with me, it just kept going, which is maybe the cruelest part of these moments. You want time to split, but it only bends around you and carries on. Have you ever been named by someone you love? Not the name on your birth certificate, the other one. The one they give you when they've decided who you are. Lazy, difficult, too much, not enough, burden. It's strange how fast those words move in, how quickly they hang pictures, unpack boxes, make themselves at home in your chest. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I pressed my napkin into tiny squares, the way I used to fold notes in middle school when I wanted to hide what mattered. My mother took another sip, waiting for me to perform the role she'd written for me long ago, the girl with the soft heart and the quick apology. But I had run out of apologies that didn't belong to me. I tried to remember the last time my name sounded like love in this house. Maybe it was the year I won the 6th grade writing award and placed the ribbon by the toaster so she'd see it. She'd said, "That's nice, Rachel," like she was commenting on the weather. "That's nice." Then she asked if my brother needed new cleats. Family is funny, people say. What they mean is, it's complicated and it's going to hurt. We are told blood is thicker than water, as if viscosity guarantees mercy. But I've learned that sometimes the water in a stranger's kindness can carry you farther than the blood in a parent's judgment. I looked at my mother then, really looked. At the woman who had taught me how to sew a button and burn a bridge in the same afternoon. At the hand around the stem of the glass, steady as a verdict. She had already moved on, asking my brother about a meeting on Tuesday, as if she hadn't just picked up a word like a stone and thrown it through my window. There are sentences that close doors and sentences that close houses. Hers did both. I placed my fork down. The plate wobbled and settled. A long minute passed. The green beans went cold. In the glass reflection of the kitchen window, I could see myself sitting there, a grown woman who still wanted her mother to choose a different word. The want itself felt childish. The ache, not so much. If you've ever sat through a meal like that, you know how it feels to carry a storm in your throat and keep swallowing. You learn there are two kinds of strength, the kind that stays and the kind that leaves. That night, I met the second kind. I didn't announce it. I didn't stand or slam or break. I just let the truth arrive, quiet as a small bird landing on a fence. I could not keep letting someone name me wrong and call it love. And with that, chapter 1 ends where a different life begins, not with a bang, but with a single, steady breath. I wish I could tell you that night was the first time my mother had used that word, but the truth is, it had been there all along, just not spoken so plainly. My childhood was a long hallway lined with comparisons, each door labeled with my brother's name. He was the golden boy, the son who carried their pride on his shoulders. Quarterback, honor student, the one whose trophies shone in the living room light like small suns. I was the quiet one, the girl with notebooks filled with words no one asked to hear. I once placed a ribbon from a writing contest on the kitchen counter, waiting for her to notice. She did, eventually. "That's nice, Rachel," she said, without lifting her eyes from the cleats she was ordering for my brother. That ribbon disappeared into the trash before the week was done. It wasn't just the forgetting that hurt. It was the silence, the way my father's eyes slid past mine when I needed them to hold steady. He was a man worn down by warehouses and late shifts, a man who believed survival was measured in hours worked, not words spoken. He never raised his voice, never raised his hand, but he also never raised me out of the shadows. And my mother, she carried her own ghosts, I know that now. But as a child, all I saw was sharpness. She treated me as if I were a thorn that kept snagging her fingers, an inconvenience in her bouquet of perfection. Have you ever felt yourself erased in your own home? Not punished, not beaten, just quietly unwelcome. It is its own kind of exile, one that happens while you are still sitting at the family table. You laugh when they laugh, but no one is listening for your voice. You celebrate their victories, but yours are met with nods that vanish like smoke. By the time I was a teenager, I had already learned the art of disappearing. At dinner, I would fold my napkin into neat little squares because neatness was safer than opinion. I would take long walks around the block after school, not because I had somewhere to go, but because home was the place I was most invisible. That Sunday night when she finally called me a burden, the word did not arrive as a stranger. It arrived as an old acquaintance, stepping fully into the room, removing its coat, making itself comfortable. And maybe that's why I didn't argue. Maybe that's why I didn't shout. Because deep down, a part of me had been preparing my whole life to finally hear the name she'd been calling me without words. I grew up believing that home was the place you could fall and be caught. You know the line, blood is thicker than water, handed down like a family recipe, as if it could guarantee tenderness. I held on to that belief the way a child clutches a blanket, not because it was warm, but because I was cold. After the dinner, I lay awake and replayed 100 smaller moments that had been trying to tell me the truth long before my mother said the word out loud. The time I had the flu in 9th grade and a fever bright enough to light the hallway. My mother stood in the doorway with the thermometer, glanced at the number and said, "You'll be fine," because my brother's playoff game started in an hour. The time I got my first job at the library and brought home a schedule like a proud offering. She read it, nodded, and asked if I could drive my brother to practice at 6. The year I was accepted to a small college 2 states away, and she said, "That's nice," then asked if I had considered staying close. Someone had to keep an eye on things here. It wasn't cruelty that cut, not exactly. It was arbitration. The math where I was always the smaller number, the remainder left over after the real calculations were done. I had mistaken that math for love because it was the only equation I'd ever seen. Funny how strangers taught me what family didn't. A teacher, Mrs. Avery, who wrote "You have a voice" in the margin of my essay and pressed the pen into my hand like a key. A neighbor, Mr. Dolly, who fixed my flat bike tire and told me not to be afraid of asking for help. The cashier at the corner store who knew my name and asked about my day with a sincerity that made me answer honestly. Water can carry you, it turns out, when the blood in your house has grown too heavy to move. There is a moment when a belief dies. It doesn't happen with fanfare. It's quiet, like a candle giving up its last inch of wick. That night, I felt the last glow of family is a sanctuary, flicker and fade. In the darkness that followed, I could finally see the outlines of the room. The dining table wasn't an altar, it was just wood. The chandelier didn't bless us, it just hummed. And my mother was not a priestess casting sacred names. She was a woman with a story about me that I no longer had to live inside. When a story is told about you long enough, you begin to borrow its furniture. You sit in the chair marked less. You sleep in the bed labeled burden. You keep your coat on because you are never staying. But stories can be returned. You can carry them back to the counter and say, "This doesn't fit," even if your hands shake. I thought about the afternoon light that fell across our kitchen floor, a soft gold sheet I had loved since childhood. I used to lie there with a book and believe the sun itself meant safety. But light is just light. It doesn't pick sides, it shows you what is. And what I saw now was this. I could keep living in a house where love had rules I would never learn, or I could step into a world that might not know me but would let me name myself. People talk about courage like it's loud, all drum and trumpet. Mine was small and stubborn. It sounded like breath in my own throat. It felt like a hand unclenching. It tasted like a word I had been afraid to say, enough. In the morning, everything looked the same. The coffee maker hissed. My father tied his boots, the same careful knot he'd made every day of my life. My brother checked his phone. My mother moved through the kitchen with the choreography of habit, reaching for the salt without looking, sliding a pan onto the flame, lifting her glass to the light to see if it was clean. I watched them with a kind of tenderness I didn't expect, the way you'd watch people on a train platform you're leaving behind. They were not villains. They were just people who had taught me something the hard way. I rinsed my cup, set it upside down in the sink to dry, and wiped the ring of coffee from the counter with my thumb. A small act, but it felt ceremonial, like closing a book and sliding it back onto a shelf. I understood, finally, that the safety I wanted was not going to be handed to me over this table. If I wanted a place I could fall and be caught, I would have to build it, and I would have to start by stepping outside. I didn't leave with a suitcase. I left with a duffel bag that still smelled faintly of high school gym floors and winter air. I pulled it from the back of my closet and laid it open on the bed. You learn a lot about yourself by what you decide to carry when you can't carry much. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 t-shirts, a sweater I'd mended twice, the notebook with Mrs. Avery's comment on the first page, a dog-eared paperback that had kept me company through a lonely freshman fall, toothbrush, socks rolled into themselves like small promises. I stood in the doorway of my room and looked at the life I wasn't taking, the lamp with the crooked shade, the shoebox of photos under the bed, the 6th grade ribbon I thought I'd thrown away, but had actually tucked behind a stack of old magazines. There is a tenderness to leaving that no one warns you about. You think it will be all steel and spine, but it's also a hand resting for a moment on the headboard, a thumb tracing the paint chip near the window, a last glance at the patch of sunlight on the floor where you learn to love quiet. I wrote a note, not for drama, just for the record. "I'll be okay. Please don't call tonight." I set it on my desk where my mother would see it in the morning. I didn't sign it with love, not because I didn't have any left, but because I didn't want to use that word like a spare key we kept losing. The house was dim, the way houses are after they've said most of what they have to say. My father's boots by the door. My brother's jacket slung over the banister like an afterthought. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and lemon cleaner, the blood and water of our particular religion. I slid my duffel strap over my shoulder, took one breath, then another. Courage, I've learned, is measured in breaths you take on purpose. Outside, evening had just tipped into night. The Ohio sky was a deep blue that made the street lamps look warmer than they were. A neighbor's sprinkler ticked through its rotation, blessing a lawn that didn't need it. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and then remembered sleep. The air was cool enough to make me wish I'd packed another sweater, but not cold enough to turn me back. I walked, past the mailbox with our name in faded vinyl letters, past Mrs. Caffrey's porch, where I'd once sold lemonade for 50 cents and learned that people will gladly pay $1 if you look them in the eye. Past the oak tree that had dropped its leaves in storms and shade in summers, and once, a branch big enough to dent my brother's first car. The town looked exactly as it always had, which somehow made my leaving feel more real, like I was the only moving part in a picture. I didn't have a destination that first night, just a direction, away. But away has a way of sharpening into toward if you keep walking. I headed for the bus line that ran along Main, where there was a diner that stayed open late and a motel that rented rooms by the week. The diner would hire if you were willing to pour coffee and keep your sleeves rolled. The motel would shelter if you had enough cash to look like you belonged, and a face that said you wouldn't bring trouble to the thin walls. On the way, I thought about calling someone. A friend, Mrs. Avery, even Mr. Dolly with the steady hands and the bike pump. But there is a certain kind of beginning that asks you to hear your own voice first. I kept the phone in my pocket and let my steps do the talking. At the corner by the pharmacy, a kid on a skateboard sailed past, earbuds in, arms loose, the easy miracle of balance. For a moment, I envied him, how he could lean into motion and trust the ground to meet him. Then I realized I was doing a version of that myself, just slower and with more luggage. The diner's neon sign buzzed open into the night. Inside, the light was the color of butter and the air smelled like sugar and grease, both comforts in their own ways. A waitress with silver hair and a name tag that said Joe was refilling the pie case. She looked up, took me in the way people do when they've seen every kind of story cross their threshold, and nodded toward a booth. "Kitchen's cleaning the grill," she said, setting down a laminated menu. "I can get you coffee and pie." "I can pay for the coffee," I said. I also wanted to ask if you're hiring." She tilted her head. "You any good at not spilling things?" "I can learn," I said, which was the truest answer I had. "Come back at 7 in the morning," she replied. "Bring shoes you can stand in." I thanked her and wrapped my hands around the coffee mug like it was a small animal I'd been trusted to keep warm. The first sip was bitter and perfect. I hadn't eaten since the beans went cold at home, but hunger felt far away, like something that belonged to a different person. I watched the door open and close, men with tired shoulders, a woman with a baby on her hip, a teenage couple laughing into their fingers. You can tell a lot about a town by who shows up for pie after 9. When I left, Joe slipped a small brown bag across the counter. "Cinnamon roll," she said. "For the walk." I didn't order. "Consider it training," she said. "You'll be running this stuff to tables tomorrow." The motel 2 blocks down had a vacancy sign that blinked like a heartbeat. The man at the desk slid a form toward me without asking questions I couldn't afford to answer. The room smelled like old carpet and bleach and second chances. The bedspread was a floral pattern that had seen happier decades. I set my bag on the chair, sat on the edge of the bed, and felt the springs answer back. The quiet was different here, less like being ignored, more like being allowed. I took the cinnamon roll out of the bag and tore off a piece. It tasted like mornings I hadn't had yet. I opened my notebook and wrote the date, then one sentence. "I am not leaving, I am arriving." It wasn't poetry, but it felt like map-making. Before I slept, I thought of my mother, the Merlot glass, the word she'd chosen. I let it move through me and then past me like a train I wasn't boarding. Tomorrow, I'd buy a cheap alarm clock. Tomorrow, I'd show up at 7 with shoes I could stand in. Tomorrow, I'd learn the menu and the names and the rhythm of the place. For now, I lay back, stared at the ceiling with its soft constellation of plaster, and listened to the hum of the air conditioner. It sounded, to my surprise, like a lullaby, not the kind anyone sings to you, the kind you hum for yourself when you finally understand no one else has to. Morning came with the pale buzz of the motel alarm clock and the soft ache of a decision beginning to cost something. I laced my shoes the way Joe had told me, tight enough to stay, loose enough to breathe, and walked back to the diner before the sun had fully made up its mind. 7 a.m. is a different city. The streets belong to delivery trucks and people who keep their promises. Joe handed me an apron and a pen with a chew mark that wasn't mine yet. "Rule 1, she said, tying the strings behind my back like she was fastening me to a new life. "Coffee never runs dry." "Rule 2, smile with the eyes." "Rule 3, if you don't know, ask." I learned the choreography fast enough. Mugs down with the handle to the right, plates carried on the left, call out behind like a minor prayer every time you cross a back that's busy. I spilled a little milk, burned one piece of toast, and apologized to a man in a suit who waved me off like he'd been a beginner once, too. A waitress named Carla showed me how to stack 4 plates on one arm and said, "You'll never think about balance the same way again." She was right. By noon, my wrists knew the weight of pancakes by heart. Between orders, I caught my breath by the dish sink, where the water steamed like a winter pond and the plates clinked their small music. I didn't tell anyone where I'd slept or why my hands shook when I first poured coffee. I didn't have to. People who live by shifts recognize the tremor of a new start. They nodded and made room. The first tips were coins and crumpled singles that felt like a vote of confidence. I folded them carefully in my notebook, next to the sentence I'd written the night before. On my break, I bought a bus pass and a pack of instant oatmeal from the corner store. The clerk asked how I was doing, and I said, "Trying," which felt like the most honest thing I'd said in months. Days settled into a rhythm. Wake, walk, pour, clear, learn the faces and the orders that belong to them. Mr. Klein liked his eggs over medium and told me a new joke every Tuesday. The young mom with the purple stroller needed her pancakes cut in half before they hit the table. The night shift nurse came in at 11 with eyes like 2 tired moons and counted out exact change even when she didn't have to, as if the act of precision could steady something inside her. After a week, Joe put my name on the schedule without the training asterisk. "You're getting your sea legs," she said, sliding a slice of pie onto the counter when no one was looking. "Eat. You pour better when you don't sway." The motel rent was due every Friday. I paid in cash and asked for a receipt because I'd learned that paper can be a kind of shield. The room was small but honest. I kept it tidy, partly because there wasn't much to put away and partly because neat corners made the days feel contained. I bought a second-hand lamp from a thrift store and an alarm clock that didn't blink. It ticked instead, each second a small permission to go on. The money wasn't enough yet. That's how beginnings work. They ask for more than you have and then ask again. On my second Friday at the diner, a man left a business card under his saucer. "Night clerk, gas and go, 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., reliable help needed." I held it in my palm and felt the weight of what it meant. Sleep would become a luxury, so would complaint. I took the job. Nights at the gas station were their own weather, fluorescent light. The hum of refrigerators full of things nobody needs but everybody wants at 2 in the morning. Truckers who smelled like road and kindness. Teenagers buying energy drinks with the solemnity of men purchasing diamonds. I learned the register, the lottery machine, the dance of politeness that keeps strangers from turning into trouble. At 3 a.m., there's a silence that doesn't exist at any other hour, something like the world inhaling and waiting to see what you'll do with it. Between customers, I did math in a small notebook. Diner wages plus tips, gas station hours, motel rent, bus pass, food. I tried an envelope system I'd read about on a flyer at the library. Rent, food, savings, unexpected. Some weeks the unexpected envelope was a joke. Some weeks it saved me. A flat tire, a copay, A winter coat for half off in a bin marked clearance that felt like it was winking at me. I ate simply, oatmeal in the morning, a cinnamon roll if Joe was feeling generous, peanut butter and bananas when the diner pay hit, noodles when it didn't. On Sundays, I gave myself oranges because their brightness felt like a promise kept. I wrote when I could. 10 minutes on the bus, 3 lines during a lull at the station, a paragraph at the motel with my feet in hot water because someone once told me that kindness starts at the edges and moves inward. I learned the city's soft map, which bus driver would wait the extra 30 seconds if you were running, which crosswalk froze in the rain, which streetlight buzzed above the bench where I sometimes sat between shifts and watched the sky lighten without commentary. I also learned the names of the motel's night desk clerks, the janitor who whistled Sinatra at dawn, the security guard who read mystery novels, and underlined every metaphor like he was marking a trail. Exhaustion has stages. At first, it blares. Then it whispers. Then it becomes a low tide that pulls at your ankles every hour of the day. I made small rules to keep from being swept under. Water before coffee, calluses are not a character flaw, write one sentence even if it's bad, thank the person who holds the door even if you could have managed it yourself. I taped a note to the motel mirror. Strong is a verb. Slowly, the numbers in my notebook began to widen, not by much, just enough for breath to pass through. Enough to look at apartment listings tacked to the laundromat corkboard and think, maybe. Enough to price second-hand couches and laugh at the distance between where I was and a room with a couch, and then circle the least ugly one anyway. On a Tuesday late in the month, I walked past a building with a crooked, for rent, sign and a landlord who didn't blink when I said, "I work 2 jobs." He showed me a studio that smelled like fresh paint and last winter. The window faced east. In the morning, I imagined the light would arrive like good news. The rent was high for me and low for the neighborhood, which is to say, barely possible. I did the math twice and then a third time, the way you do when hope and caution are arguing softly in the back of your head. "I'll take it," I heard myself say, like a woman who believed in her own future out loud. That night at the gas station, a man bought a winning scratch-off and let out a whoop that startled the slumbering hour. He handed me $1 and said, "For luck." I slid it into the savings envelope when I got back to the motel and laughed at myself for being sentimental about paper. But that's the thing about building something from almost nothing. You learn to love the almost. You learn to count the inches and call them miles because you walked them all the same. When my shift ended, and the sky was the color of an unripe peach, I stood outside and watched the first bus of the morning bend the corner. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible. I thought of the steam rising from the potatoes the night my mother named me, and how I had watched it to be sure I was still there. I didn't need the proof anymore. Move-in day was a Tuesday, which felt like good luck because Tuesdays aren't trying to impress anyone. The landlord handed me 2 keys on a brass ring that had been someone else's before it was mine. They were heavier than I expected, weighty the way responsibility is, and they clicked in my palm like small applause. The studio was 1 room and a bathroom that whistled when the shower ran. The window faced east, and even with the blinds crooked, morning pooled on the floor like a promise I could stand in. I learned quickly that a home is not made by square footage, but by the order in which you do things. I started with a broom and a bucket. The mop left wide, damp commas on the floor as if the room were pausing to consider becoming mine. I opened the window and let the October air walk through. I wiped the baseboards, the way my mother had taught me, and realized the lesson had survived even if the tenderness hadn't. A thrift store delivered a couch the color of oatmeal and a lamp whose shade listed to the left, as if listening. Joe gave me a set of mismatched plates wrapped in newspaper that left headlines on my fingers. "You'll want something that clinks," she said. Silence is overrated. I ate my first meal on the floor, oatmeal, appropriately enough, and balanced the bowl on a moving box turned sideways. I wrote the word table on the box with a marker and laughed. Naming a thing isn't the same as owning it, but it helps. The days stitched themselves together with a thread I recognized. Work, bus, home. The diner shifted from place to job to rhythm. Joe taught me how to hear a refill request just by the way a customer glanced at a mug. Carla showed me how to slide a plate to the edge of a table without startling a baby asleep in a car seat. Every action has an echo, she said, and I wrote it down in my notebook that night because I suspected it was about more than plates. At the gas station, the register keys became familiar under my fingers. I learned which lottery players were lucky by how gently they scratched, as if kindness could coax fortune from cardboard. I kept a roll of quarters in the drawer for people who came up short, and a jar of lollipops for kids with the kind of eyes that looked older than their years. The manager noticed and said, "You're good at keeping the temperature down." I wasn't sure if he meant the room or the world. Either way, it felt like a compliment. Money was still a careful dance. The envelopes grew soft at the edges, opened and closed the way a prayer book does. I slid my first rent into the landlord's hand with a calm that surprised me. It wasn't plenty, but it was enough. Enough is underrated until you've lived without it. On Saturdays after my morning shift, I walked to the community center 2 blocks from the laundromat. There was a bulletin board with flyers for language classes, a canned food drive, a flyer for a grief group, one for yoga. I took a library card at the branch next door and carried home a stack of paperbacks like a bouquet that wouldn't wilt. One book had a line about how the soul grows in the dark like a seed. I underlined it with a pencil stub and taped it above the sink. On the same piece of tape, I wrote, "Strong is a verb." The mirror agreed. Neighbors appeared the way neighbors do, first as shapes, then as names, then as stories. Mrs. Torah's in 2B watered a overflowing army of houseplants and pressed a basil cutting into my hand like she was introducing me to someone important. "Put it in a jar," she said. "Let it learn your light." The man in 3A wore paint-flecked jeans and always carried a ladder. He loaned it to me so I could straighten the lamp shade and hang a cheap curtain that turned the room from exposed to held. A kid on the 3rd floor stomped his way down the stairs each morning like a cheerful parade. He waved when he saw me and shouted, "Hi, Miss Coffee," because he'd seen me in my apron. I didn't correct him. It felt like a title I'd earned. I kept writing in snatches, a paragraph between bus stops, a memory on my 10-minute break behind the diner, a sentence before I fell asleep with the lamp still on. One afternoon, Mrs. Avery's pen note drifted out of my notebook like a bookmark. "You have a voice." I pinned it on the wall above the makeshift table box, gave it a thumbtack like a medal. Small victories arrived quietly. Joe bumped me to the morning rush and handed me a section of the tip pool with a, "Don't make me regret this." That sounded suspiciously like trust. At the station, the manager put me on the weekly schedule board permanently and didn't hover when I counted the drawer. The bus driver with the gray beard started waiting the extra half-minute when he saw me sprinting down the block, one hand in the air, the other convincing my legs not to quit. He'd pull the lever and say, "Made it by a breath," and I'd nod, grateful for the grace. I bought a second-hand table at a church sale for $10 and carried it home in pieces, laughing out loud at how something could be both heavy and worth every step. I screwed the legs on with a borrowed screwdriver and set a glass of water in the center, just to see how it looked. The glass caught a stripe of morning and threw it back onto the wall. The room felt suddenly bigger, as if it had exhaled. On a night when sleep wouldn't come, I walked to the window and watched the street in its nighttime honesty. A couple argued softly and then laughed. A delivery truck idled, coughed, moved. Somewhere a radio played a song I recognized from a summer when I believed all songs were about me. I rested my forehead against the cool glass and understood, maybe for the first time, that the safety I wanted was never going to be someone else's to hand me. It was this, a door that locked, a table that didn't wobble, a lamp that leaned but stayed, a plant learning my light. The next morning, the east window kept its promise. The sun slid across the floor and touched the basil jar like a blessing. I made coffee in a thrifted percolator that hissed and clicked and finally declared itself done. I sat at my $10 table, opened my notebook, and wrote a sentence that felt less like a report and more like a vow. I live here. The phone lay face down beside the mug. It had been quiet for weeks. No unknown, "Are you coming home?" No apologies wrapped in barbed wire. No invitations that were really summons. Silence can be punishment or it can be permission. In that moment, it felt like the latter. I folded the rent receipt into the paper shield envelope, rinsed my cup, and set it upside down on the rack. Outside, the bus sighed at the curb. I lifted my bag, locked the door, and slid the keys into my pocket. They didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt earned. The weeks didn't get easier so much as they got legible. I could read my days the way you learn to read a stranger's handwriting, slowly at first, then all at once. At the diner, I stopped counting mistakes and started counting regulars. Mr. Klein told worse jokes and tipped better. The night shift nurse began asking for a booth near the window because the light makes it feel like morning, and I understood exactly what she meant. Joe handed me the order pad during the Saturday rush and said, "You call it," which is how I learned there's a music to a busy room. Hash browns on the offbeat, omelets landing on the one. At the gas station, I could stock a cooler without looking, bottles sliding into place like a small choir lining up. A teenage boy asked me how to tie a tie for an interview and stood awkwardly still while I talked him through the steps, our reflections practicing in the safety glass. He came back a week later in the same tie, smiling like he'd found a door he didn't know he could open. He bought a single red rose from the bucket by the register and paid in coins he'd counted twice. "For my mom," he said. "She likes proof." I wished him luck with a seriousness that surprised us both. Money widened by inches. I bought real sheets that didn't scratch and a set of white towels that felt like a truce with the world. I learned to cook 3 things well enough that feeding myself didn't feel like an apology. Eggs in a pan that finally didn't stick, soup that tasted better on the second day, and pasta with a basil leaf I pinched from the plant misses. Toras insisted on calling ours. The plant thrived. I took it personally. I kept writing, small things at first, postcards to no one, notes about the way people hold a coffee cup when they're telling the truth. I sent an essay to a tiny local zine because their flyer said, "We like honest sentences," and that felt like a dare I could meet. Weeks later, an envelope slid under my studio door with 2 copies inside and my name in a font that didn't know me yet. I taped the page above the table and didn't tell anyone. Some victories prefer quiet. There were setbacks. A fever that ate 2 days and part of my paycheck. A bus that never came. A morning when a man cursed me for bringing his eggs over hard instead of medium, and I had to step into the alley and cry quick and private, then return with new eggs and no evidence but a steady hand. But the life I was building started to hold even when the wind picked up. That's the test, I think, not whether it gleams, but whether it stays. On Sundays, I walked without headphones, past the thrift store that always smelled like cedar and memory, past a park where fathers pushed swings and mothers folded blankets in triangles, the geometry of care. I sat on a bench and let the sun find my face, not because the week had earned it, but because I had. I thought of the kitchen table I'd left and the words that had tried to make a home in my chest. The difference now wasn't that I'd forgotten them. It was that they no longer had furniture here. Joe began trusting me with the opening. Keys in my hand at 5:30 a.m., lights blinking awake one by one, the coffee maker's first impatient sigh. There is a holiness to empty rooms just before they become useful. I wiped the counter with the same slow circles my mother had taught me and didn't flinch at the thought. Lessons aren't loyalties, I'd decided. You can keep one and not the other. One evening, after rent was paid and the envelopes weren't hollow, I bought a second-hand radio with a dial that clicked as it turned. It picked up 3 stations reliably, oldies, baseball, and sermons that spoke more about mercy than rules. I let it murmur in the background while I cooked, the window open, the basil catching a breeze like it had learned to breathe with me. The room smelled like tomatoes and laundry soap. It smelled like staying. The phone stayed mostly face down, mostly quiet. When it lit up, it was usually Carla sending a photo of a lopsided cake her daughter had made, or the gas station manager asking if I could cover a dawn shift because you're steady, Thompson, and steady is gold. I slept better. I laughed more. I caught myself humming at the sink and didn't shush the sound. It was late on a Thursday when the quiet changed shape. I was shelling peas into a bowl, radio low, window open to the sound of somebody dragging a trash can to the curb. The phone vibrated across the table and skittered to a stop against my notebook. Unknown number. The kind of ring that carries history in it, even before you answer. I let it go once, twice, a third time, then set the peas down and reached for the towel to dry my hands. I don't know why I turned off the radio first. Maybe because some sentences need all the room you can give them. The second the apartment went silent, the phone began to ring again. I answered on the 4th ring. "Rachel?" My mother's voice sounded smaller than I remembered, as if distance had stolen inches from her. There was a rush of background noise, paper shuffling, a faucet, the breath of a house that knew how to worry. "Yes," I said, my hand flat on the table as if steadiness could be conducted through wood. We're behind," she began, and then the sentence collapsed under its own weight. "Your father's hours were cut. The landlord sent a notice. We have until the 1st. I didn't." She stopped, and I could hear the swallow, the part of her that had never learned to ask. "We don't know what to do." The apartment around me held still. The basil leaf in the jar quivered in a breeze I couldn't feel. On the stove, water trembled toward a boil and then thought better of it. In my chest, the old choreography tried to start up, the reflex to apologize, to rush in, to make myself small enough to fit into someone else's emergency. I set the towel down and let the impulse pass through without taking me with it. "How far behind?" I asked. My voice surprised me, level, almost administrative, not unkind, just exact. 2 months, she said. "He's looking for more work, but you know how it is. And the taxes we didn't plan." The last word broke like a thin plate. I thought of envelopes labeled rent, food, savings, unexpected, the humility of paper. I thought of the way I'd learned to count coins like prayers and how that counting had given me a quiet I wore like a coat. I thought of the night she had picked a word for me and the way that word had tried to live in my lungs. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, but not in the old way where sorry was a down payment on fixing everything. "Have you called the utility company? Sometimes they'll set up a plan. And the landlord, did you ask if you can split it over a few months?" "We tried," she said quickly, like she needed me to know she had at least learned to make phone calls. "He said he's been patient enough." There was another sound then, quiet and terrible, my mother breathing in and deciding to step over a line she'd drawn for a lifetime. "Rachel." The way she said my name was different, softer at the edges. "Can you help?" For a moment, the room doubled. In one version, I was 20 again, a girl with a ribbon by the toaster asking to be seen. In the other, I was 36, hands that could carry 4 plates, a plant learning my light, a key that fit a lock I paid for. Power is a funny word. It sounds like lightning, but often it's just being able to choose without fear. I can't pay 2 months, I said, truth the new kind. But I can help you figure this out. Silence, then, what does that mean? Not suspicious, lost. It means we'll make a plan, I said. I'll call a community service office in the morning. They sometimes cover a portion if there's a job loss. There's a church fund that helped a coworker once. I can lend you something, some, not all. I felt the shape of my limits and found to my surprise that they were steady walls, not barbed wire. But Mom, there have to be boundaries. The word landed between us like a new piece of furniture we'd have to learn to walk around. I know, she said, and the sound of it surprised us both. I know. Her voice altered again like someone learning to drive a stick shift, jerky, then smoother. I shouldn't have said what I said that night. There it was, skirting the edge of apology. I didn't go after it. I didn't force it into a shape. Instead, I leaned into what was in front of me. Do you have the notice? I asked. Can you read me the date? She rustled papers. The first, she repeated, 5 days. Okay, I said, reaching for my notebook, the one with Mrs. Avery's penciled faith pinned above the table. I wrote 5 days, landlord name, amount, contact church fund, utility plan. I wrote like a person laying planks over water. Text me a photo of the notice and the landlord's number. I'm not sure how to, she stopped, embarrassed by a piece of technology she'd refused to learn. I'll ask your father. Okay, I said again, the word had become a bridge. I get off at 3 tomorrow, I can come by at 4. The sentence was true and also a test. Could I enter that house without letting its weather override mine? 4, she repeated like an appointment with a doctor she finally trusted. Thank you. And then softer, Rachel. Yes, I know what I said, she whispered. I know. I was, she exhaled, and I could hear the glass of wine that always filled in the blanks. I was wrong. The word was plain, not dressed up to impress me. It startled something inside me, relief maybe, or grief so old it had learned to sit still. I hear you, I said. Not I forgive you, not yet. But not no. We hung up with the awkwardness of people trying out a language they should have learned years ago. The apartment came back into itself, the peas waiting, the water calm now, the basil steady in its jar. I turned the radio on low and let a song wander through the room. My hands shook a little, then stopped. I pulled the unexpected envelope from the drawer and slid it next to my notebook. I counted what was there, let the numbers be numbers and not verdicts. Enough to help, not enough to drown. I wrote a second list, what I can give, what I won't. It felt less like accounting and more like mercy with rules. When I finally lay down, the ceiling was as it always was, small constellations of plaster, a tiny crack that mapped a river across the surface. I followed it with my eyes from one wall to the other and thought about the boy in the tie, the nurse with moon eyes, Joe's steady hands, the basil leaf greeting morning. Lives intersect, and somehow we stay afloat. I didn't dream of my mother's word. I dreamed of keys, mine, theirs, new ones being cut. In the morning, I would call the church, the office, the landlord. In the afternoon, I would go back to the house that had taught me how to leave and see if I could stand there without shrinking. Mercy isn't a door you kick open. It's a hinge you oil and test until it swings without hurting you. Before sleep carried me, I whispered a sentence into the room to hear how it sounded. I can help without disappearing. The room, kind as ever, held it for me. I showed up at 4 with my notebook, a pen that wrote even when tilted, and a pocket full of quarters because I'd learned solutions sometimes come in small denominations. The house looked the same from the sidewalk, the hydrangeas gone to sticks, the porch light that had always flickered like it couldn't make up its mind. My key still fit, and that felt strange. the way an old sweater does when you pull it on and realize it remembers your shoulders. Inside, the air smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, late afternoon caught in the blinds. The table was cleared except for a neat stack of papers and a mug that read Best MOM that had never been hers in practice but had been gifted anyway. My father was at the sink, rinsing a plate that didn't need rinsing. He turned, wiped his hands on a towel, and for once met my eyes without darting away. "Thanks for coming," he said, like a man who had practiced the sentence and finally got it right. My mother sat at the table, hands folded in front of her the way she used to sit at parent-teacher conferences. She looked older, but not in a way that could be measured by years. More like someone had redrawn her in pencil and pressed too hard on the edges. The notice lay on top of the stack, bold font, exact date, amount due, a line about late fees that read like a scolding. "Can I?" I asked, and slid into the chair across from her. I picked up the notice and wrote the number at the top of my page. Then the date. Then 5 days. I took a breath that felt like stepping onto a moving walkway. "Okay, here's what I can do." My mother flinched at the word "I," as if it were the start of a lecture. I kept my voice level. "I called St. Mark's this morning," I said. "They have a small emergency fund for rent when there's a job loss. It won't cover everything, but it can cover the late fee and part of this month if we bring proof." I tapped the notice. "They're open until 6. We can go now." My father nodded too quickly, relief leaking around his eyes. "I've got the pay stubs," he said, almost eager, as if we'd invited him onto the team after a season on the bench. He pulled a thin folder from the counter and slid it across like a card he'd been saving for the right hand. "Good," I said, to my mother. "And the landlord?" I pointed to the name on the letter. "I'll call him while we're in the car, propose a plan, half now, half in 2 weeks. Not a promise we can't keep, a plan we can." She stared at me, then at the mug, then at the edge of the table where the varnish had worn thin. "We tried to call," she said quietly. He doesn't like me." There was a lifetime under that sentence. I didn't enter it. "I'll call," I repeated. "And this matters." I looked between them. "I can lend some, not all. I can't carry this whole thing, and I won't. I'll write a check for 1 month on the condition that we put a budget in place tonight. Groceries, utilities, no surprises, and Mom, the wine." I let the word sit without accusation. "We can't pay rent and pay for Merlot." Her face tightened, then smoothed as if the muscle itself had decided to surrender. "I know," she said. It sounded like a confession rehearsed in private. I've been trying." She swallowed. "I'll try harder." "Trying is a start," I said, "but we need numbers." I pulled an envelope from my bag and wrote on it rent, another utilities, another food. I slid them across the table. "It's old-fashioned," I said, "but it keeps the truth in view." My father reached for the envelopes like a man reaching for a rope. "We can do that," he said. Then, softly, like he was learning to speak a dialect he'd once avoided. "Boundaries." We drove to St. Mark's in the kind of silence you use when you're learning to breathe together again. The church office smelled like paper and coffee, the universal scent of small bureaucracies doing their best. A woman named Elaine sat behind a desk with a candy dish and a calendar of farmhouses. She listened the way some people pray, full attention, no hurry. My father laid out the stubs. I handed over the notice. My mother kept her hands folded and unfolded in her lap, a small nervous bird that didn't know where to land. "We can cover the late fee and a third of this month," Elaine said after a few phone calls and the kind of typing that sounds hopeful. "It'll be a check directly to the landlord. You'll need to make a plan for the rest." She looked at me then, not as a child or a savior, but as a person sitting in a chair. "You seem to have one." "In pieces," I said. "But yes." Back in the car, I called the landlord. I did not beg, I did not posture. I laid out the math, the church check, the halves. He sighed the way men sigh when they want to be angry, but the paperwork is too tidy. 2 weeks, he said finally. No more. 2 weeks, I agreed and wrote it down in my notebook as if ink could make it real. At the grocery store, we shopped like people who had learned the price of things the hard way. Rice, beans, frozen vegetables, eggs. My mother reached for a bottle and then pulled her hand back like the label had teeth. She put oranges in the cart instead, and I nearly cried over citrus. Back at the house, we spread receipts and envelopes on the table the way we used to spread puzzle pieces. My father counted cash, smooth and careful. I wrote categories and totals. My mother read numbers out loud, her voice steadier each time, as if clarity itself were medicine. When the plan was done, I wrote the landlord's name on the rent envelope and slid in the church check and my own. It made a new sound when it landed, heavier, certain. We sat there for a moment, 3 people who had never learned to do this together, looking at the evidence that we could. My mother's eyes were wet, but the tears sat without falling like guests who decided not to stay. Rachel, she said, just my name. She waited, then tried again. I was wrong. The sentence wore no adornment. It didn't kneel or grovel. It stood simple and true. I felt something in me set down a weight I'd forgotten I was carrying. I hear you, I said, and then because truth had been good to us that afternoon, hearing isn't the same as forgetting. I touched the envelopes with my fingertips. We do this every week. We don't skip it when things look fine. We don't pretend we don't need it. We keep count in the open. My father nodded. My mother nodded. The room exhaled. I washed the dinner dishes that night because my hands needed a task. My mother dried them and put them away without rearranging the order. My father took out the trash and returned without lingering by the door. Small things, but marriages and families turn on hinges that small. When I stood to leave, my mother reached for me and then stopped, her hand hovering like a question. I met her halfway, the middle of the kitchen tile, and we did an awkward choreography of people who had forgotten steps. It wasn't an embrace so much as an agreement to try again where we could. Outside, the evening had the same cool bite it always had. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. I held the rail for a second, the way you do when you're choosing your next step on a staircase. Behind me, the house was still the house that taught me how to leave. But it had also, for an hour or two, learned a new word. Stay. On the walk to the bus stop, I counted the planks I'd laid that day. Calls, checks, envelopes, sentences said plainly. None of it erased the past. None of it promised an easy future. But it was a bridge, and it held when we walked across together. That, I decided, would be enough for now. 2 weeks is not a long time unless you're waiting for proof that a plan can hold. I lived those days like a person carrying a full glass across a crowded room, carefully, eyes forward, one steady breath at a time. At the diner, I took the opening shift and the Sunday close, the bookends of a week that needed all the binding it could get. I learned how to move faster without rushing, how to listen for what people meant instead of just what they ordered. When Mr. Klein told a joke so bad the busboy pretended to faint, I laughed long enough to feel it in my ribs. At the station, I traded 1 midnight for 2 dawns. The manager said, "You make mornings behave," and I wrote that down because it felt like a kind of armor. At home, the new home, the studio with the east window, I kept the envelopes visible, not hidden in a drawer. On the wall above my $10 table, the zine page with my essay curled at the corners, a paper anchor. The basil plant had grown leggy and needed pinching back. I snipped and stirred the leaves into pasta and felt a small, ridiculous pride, the way you do when something you tended starts tending you back. On the 4th day, my mother called with numbers instead of panic. "We've put $62 in the food envelope," she said, and I could hear the counting in her breath. "Your father paid the gas bill on the phone." "I didn't." she trailed off, then returned to the lane. I bought seltzer. The bubbles trick me. There was shame in it and also a spark of strategy. I said, good, and meant it. On the 5th day, I took a bus to the house after my shift to go over the plan again, not because I didn't trust them, but because I was learning that consistency is just trust repeated. My mother had written categories on sticky notes and pressed them to the wall like labels in a museum. Rent, food, utilities, car, unexpected. The best MOM mug held pens instead of wine. My father set out 3 glasses of water and a bowl of oranges that smelled like sunlight. We counted receipts, circled totals, moved a $10 bill from the wrong envelope to the right, and no one flinched. 2 days, my father said, tapping the rent envelope with a finger that had learned gentleness late but well. I spoke to the landlord. He'll meet us in the lobby. I'll be there, I said, and my mother nodded once as if agreement were a muscle she was building. That night, back in my studio, I found myself at the window with the radio off. The quiet pressed close, not as an emptiness but as a listener. Forgiveness hovered like whether I could feel but not name. I thought of the word I'd been given, burden, and the way it had tried to colonize my life. I had evicted it, the room was mine now. But forgiveness wasn't moving the word's boxes to a new corner. It was choosing not to live by its map. There were tests, the kind that don't announce themselves. At the diner, a man barked at me for bringing bacon when he'd said sausage, and for a breath I saw my mother's mouth form the word again, heard the old verdict. But then Joe's hand touched my elbow, just enough to steady, not to steer, and I replaced the plate, apologized once, not twice, and let the moment pass without renting its space. At the station, a boy tried to pay for a candy bar with a handful of nickels and 2 foreign coins. Short, I said, soft, and he scraped his palm until he found a dime. Now you're even, I said, and put the dimes in the drawer. Even felt righteous and kind at the same time. I walked home thinking about how balance looks like mercy from one angle and like math from another, and how both are true. The morning of the deadline, I met my parents in the building lobby with the same notebook I'd brought 2 weeks earlier, the one that had become less a ledger and more a compass. The landlord was a man who had perfected the look of someone tired of stories. He wore impatience like a tie. I handed him the church check first, then my contribution, then my father's cash, and said, "Here is the plan for next month in writing." I kept my voice level, not a plea, a proposal backed by paper and practice. He read, sighed, and nodded in the reluctant way people nod when they've run out of reasons to say no. 2 weeks ago, he said to my mother, "You were a mess." The sentence should have stung. Instead, my mother met his eyes and said, "We're working a plan." The we landed and stayed. The receipt he handed us was just ink on thermal paper, but it felt like a certificate of something larger. Not salvation, not yet, but participation. We stepped outside, 3 people blinking the way you blink when the sky is suddenly brighter than the room you've been in. On the sidewalk, my mother reached into her bag and pulled out her keys. She slid a wine opener off the ring and set it in my palm. "I don't need this," she said, not a flourish. A fact. I didn't cheer. I didn't lecture. I closed my fingers around the cool metal and slipped it into my pocket like a relic from a religion I no longer served. Back at the house, she brewed tea and set the kettle on a heat ring that had been burned into the stove years ago. "I am trying," she said, and the present tense saved us both. My father unfolded the paper from St. Mark's and smoothed it with his palm. "Elaine said we can volunteer at the food drive next Saturday," he added, tentative, like he needed permission to be useful. "We could." "You should," I said. "It helps to be on both sides of a table." We ate soup at the table that had held so many quiet wars. The soup wasn't perfect. It was oversalted by a hand that was learning to measure again. No one complained. Midway through, my mother set her spoon down and said, Rachel, I don't know how to say this right. She paused, as if she were taking attendance in a room full of missing words. You deserved better from me. The sentence didn't ask for an answer, it was its own answer. A younger me would have filled the space with quick absolutions, eager to trade pain for peace at any price. The woman I was becoming took a breath, tasted the salt, and chose clarity. Thank you, I said. I'm working on what forgiveness looks like. I touched the table. It looks like this today. Today, my father echoed and nodded as if he could feel the scaffolding under the word. When dusk settled, I stood to leave. My mother moved toward me and then stopped, not from fear but from attention. We didn't hug like people in movies, all orchestras and resolution. We stood close enough to count eyelashes, and then stepped back with the same care we'd used to step forward. You can call that distance. I chose to call it respect. On the bus home, the city slid by in panes of glass. A boy bouncing a basketball alone, a woman laughing into her phone, a dog determined to herd a family down the sidewalk. My reflection looked like someone I would be kind to if I didn't know her. I took the wine opener from my pocket and turned it in my hand, its small helix catching the last of the light. I thought about relics, how they remind and release at the same time. At the studio, the east window was already a dusky mirror. I set the opener in the drawer with the envelopes, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of a hinge that had turned. I boiled water and poured it over a tea bag, the string draped like a flag of surrender I could live with. I sat at the table and opened my notebook. I wrote, "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is deciding which truths you will live by." Then below that, today's truths, keys, envelopes, oranges, a plan that held. A word returned to the sender without ceremony. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. It was enough. The radio clicked on by itself, an old quirk I hadn't figured out how to fix, and a voice came through the static talking about the forecast, colder tomorrow, then clear. I smiled into my cup. Weather changes. You keep a coat by the door and your name where you can reach it. In the morning, the east window would keep its promise. I would wake, lace my shoes, and go make the rooms I entered kinder than I found them. That, I thought, was my part of the bargain with this life. When I turned off the lamp, the room held shape in the dark. Table, plant, chair, bed. Nothing grand. Everything earned. I lay down and let the day empty out of me until there was space for sleep. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor's laugh rose and fell like a wave that didn't need me to stay afloat. I let it pass. Tomorrow, there would be coffee and pie, an exact change, and maybe a kid who needed a tie explained again. Tomorrow, there would be envelopes and oranges and a basil plant that kept learning my light. And somewhere across town, there would be a house that once taught me how to leave, learning, slowly, what it meant to hold. The weeks that followed did not erase the past, but they reshaped it. The word my mother had once thrown at me no longer echoed in my chest. It sat behind me now, like a landmark you glance at only to know how far you've walked. Our family didn't turn into a storybook ending. There were still pauses too long, silences too sharp, small missteps on the bridge we were building. But there was also the sound of coins sliding into envelopes every Friday, of my father reading grocery receipts out loud, of my mother putting a bowl of oranges in the center of the table instead of a bottle. Little by little, the house where I had once been invisible began to practice honesty. And in my own apartment, the east window kept its promise. Morning light arrived like forgiveness itself, quiet, persistent, unearned but steady. I watered the basil, brewed coffee, opened my notebook, and wrote sentences that belonged to me. I realized the real victory was not my mother asking for help or even her apology. The victory was this: I had built a life where her words no longer had power to name me. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't saying the past never happened. It's saying the past will not dictate the rest of my story. And family Family is not the myth we're handed as children. It is the people who learn, however late, to stay at the table and count the cost together. So that is my story. Mom called me a burden. Now she begs me for rent. Not a tale of revenge, but of resilience. Not a story of triumph over others, but of finding the strength to define myself and then choosing to meet bitterness with something softer. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story touched you, I wish you good health and may your family, however imperfect, bring you moments of love, peace, and laughter. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care.